The 7 Deadly Sins. Wrath.
Tonight's breaking news. A suspect is still at large after the gruesome discovery of a mutilated body at a residence in Tokyo's Adachi ward was made this evening. The deceased, identified to be 67-year-old Watanabe Noriko, was found by a neighbor who notified the police. She was found lying on the floor, bloodied and unconscious, with several stab wounds to the head and body.
What the news did not mention was that Noriko's tongue was cut off, found in one of the trash cans. Her fingers severed, placed in the dog's bowl, and eyes gouged out. The dog, a chow chow, not very often seen in Japan, was found wandering inside the citizens' forest behind the Watanabe's property by a local hiker who immediately knew who the chow chow belongs to. The hiker, who was no stranger to Noriko and Kuma the chow chow, did not waste a single second before contacting the police. She was well aware of the gruesome case that has been ongoing for a day or two by then. Kuma seems unharmed. Although he did appear to be a little bit scared, he seemed glad to have found a familiar face. A familiar face that did not want to harm him. A familiar face that did not attempt to kill him. It seems that Kuma had managed to escape the wrath of someone he knew. Noriko, on the other hand, was not as lucky. She was deep into composing a long message in her family group chat when, out of nowhere, in came the devil through her front door. He would torture her, mutilate her, and end up taking her life in the worst of ways. Genki grew up in a single-parent household with 2 older sisters and an older brother. He is the youngest in the family, a clear mistake based on the 10-year age gap between himself and his siblings. One day, after many years had gone by, one of his sisters, out of frustration and perhaps resentment, would send out this message to their family group chat.
Mom should have aborted him when she had the chance to.
Of course, the group chat did not include Genki and their mother, or else all hell would break loose. That was the family dynamic, to put it simply. Things took a turn for the worse after the father died, when Genki was barely 2 years old. The family dynamic evolved around the relationship between a mother with her son, both covert narcissists and codependent on each other. Despite that, all 3 of the older children would go on to lead normal and successful lives. The secret for them was to distance themselves as much as they could from their narcissistic mother. They did well in school and by chance got scholarships to study abroad. They moved out of the family house right after they turned 18 and had stayed away ever since, visiting only once a year. Meanwhile, Genki, who was so much younger and did not have a second parental figure, would go on to absorb his mother's characteristics. Her narcissism would rub off on him. She would often make passing comments like,
"How awfully dirty your aunt's house is. It seems like no one can be as clean as me."
After coming back from her sister-in-law's house one day. Or,
"Just ignore him, I raised you better than his mother had raised him."
After Genki got into a fight with his classmate, without fully knowing the whole situation, which was in fact caused by Genki making a rude remark to his classmate. After years of thinking that they are the best at everything they do, thanks to his mother, who had convinced him since young, it was no surprise that he had developed a narcissistic personality disorder, and one of the many traits of it is a strong sense of entitlement. In his presence for many years, she would go on to speak badly of family members, and even her own other children, all of whom had obviously distanced themselves from her toxicity. Both mother and son were never grateful for all the things that the rest of the family members had done for them. If you had booked a trip for them, all inclusive, they would complain about the long layovers at the airport. Or if the places were not as interesting as they had expected, they would spend the whole day wearing a sour look on their faces. Neither were happy to change their habits, to adapt to the different cultures in other countries or of their hosts. They did not understand how their so-called superior ways of doing things could cause inconvenience to others, like the need to shower twice a day in winter, only to rake up tens of thousands in water and gas bills, which they did not pay for. For them it was their right as guests.
If the hosts are not willing to put up with it, then they probably should not host,
Genki said. He is the perfect caricature of entitlement, failing at every aspect to empathize or to reflect on his actions, and what more, having his mother as the enabler.
The suspect in the murder case of Watanabe Noriko in Adachi Ward, Tokyo last Sunday has reportedly been caught this morning, hiding at an internet cafe in one of the neighboring wards. At the moment, police are still trying to establish the connection between the suspect and the murder victim, Watanabe Noriko.
Born to Mr. and Mrs. Ishikawa in 1957, Noriko had changed her name from Ishikawa Noriko to Watanabe Noriko after her marriage to Mr. Watanabe over 4 decades ago. She is the older child of Mr. and Mrs. Ishikawa, who also had another second child, a son named Ishikawa Makoto. Like any older sibling, Noriko did not take lightly to her responsibilities. This included the family's sake brewery business that had been running for almost a century, passed down for generations. Noriko, who was so much more capable than Makoto, had left her parents no choice but to break the tradition of passing down the business to their daughter, instead of their son, with a condition that the family's name Ishikawa would remain as the owner of the business. Everything went well for a few decades. The business grew rapidly. Makoto, happily obliged and in return, got to keep his position as the vice president of the flourishing company while receiving a decent salary. Everything changed when he had passed away suddenly one day, leaving behind his young family of 5 with nothing much, except a familial connection to the famous Ishikawa sake brewery. Makoto's wife could do nothing but to sit back and watch as Noriko took over the entire business. She, unlike Noriko, had absolutely no experience in the brewery business, always preferred to keep herself busy with household chores instead, depending solely on her husband as a provider. Now that Makoto was gone, she blames everyone but herself for her luck. She grew to resent some of her children whom she thinks added to her burden. It was like walking on eggshells when days were bad, and they often were. She would tell Genki,
Just ignore them!
Whenever arguments broke out, because she did not want to deal with the responsibilities of parenting anymore. She wished for them all to be of age, so they could just leave the house soon. She would have less mouth to feed, less conflict to resolve and void of any parental responsibilities. She would not miss a chance to let the children know how difficult it is being a single mother. Therefore, that was what the children understood. The older ones left as soon as they could, and despite such predicament, managed to do well, but Genki would stay longer and pay the price.
Police have released the identity of the suspect in the murder case of Watanabe Noriko at a residence in Adachi Ward, Tokyo, which happened a week ago. The suspect is believed to be the nephew of the victim, Mrs. Watanabe, 30-year-old Ishikawa Genki.
The day that the murder took place, an intense argument could be heard between Noriko and Genki. Noriko had invited her sister-in-law and nephew over to her place for dinner on Sunday. She had wanted to resolve the issue of the Ishikawa's family inheritance from the sale of the Ishikawa Sake Brewery recently. Noriko had apparently sold the brewery without informing the family of her late brother. After many decades of managing the brewery, she decided that it would be in the best interest of everyone to sell the business to a buyer who is willing to keep the Ishikawa family's brand name and at the same time has plans to expand the business locally as well as overseas. None of the remaining family members were interested in taking over the business anyway. What more, with Noriko's own children and the children of her late brother, who have all decided to move overseas, pursuing their own successful careers that have absolutely nothing to do with the brewery business. Unbeknownst to Noriko, while busy brewing sake for decades, in a different place nearby, at the same time, an overwhelming sense of resentment has been brewing at the house of her late brother. Her sister-in-law by now had managed to convince Genki of how evil and greedy his aunt is. Not only that, but also how ungrateful the rest of his siblings are, never sending them money, despite all the success that they had gained over the years, all thanks to her.
Did Aunt Noriko scold you again? How dare she tells you off? I will slaughter her dog if she dares to be rude to you. I will slaughter her dog and chop it to pieces. Someone should teach that bitch a lesson.
Genki would have an outburst of anger frequently in the family group chat. None of his siblings would take him seriously. He was already outrageously entitled, so whatever comes next just seemed like an extension of that. However, the day that Genki found out that Noriko had sold off the family's business, the one that he was eyeing on, but put no effort into learning the trade, was the day that Noriko had incurred his wrath. Genki, whose coping mechanism was to ignore someone whenever any disagreements happened, instead of dealing with the problems head-on, had backfired. All the vengeful anger that had been brewing from within him, the seeds of suspicion, hatred, and distrust that had been planted by his mother about Aunt Noriko for decades, had finally bare its ugly fruits.
So you found that crazy dog of hers? I would have slaughtered that idiot first if it did not run out the back door like a piece of coward shit. That ought to teach her a lesson. Just the sight of that bitch makes me sick to my stomach. I needed to teach her a lesson, so I cut that bitch's tongue off when she was still screaming. Nothing good ever came out of her filthy mouth. Oh yes, I threw it in the trash can where it belongs with all the other foul shit.
Genki could be heard making the grave confession at the interrogation room after his arrest. He felt like a martyr, about to go down, for teaching someone a lesson that she deserved. It does not matter that she had to die. All that mattered was that she felt the pain, and it ought to teach her a lesson about messing around with him.
Why did you have to cut off her fingers and gouged out her eyes?
A question one would never think to ask. However, the police officer in charge of the case had a duty to fulfill, which is to establish the murder intent.
If you had experienced what she had done to me and my family, you would have done the same too. Stealing our inheritance. We have nothing left. My mom and I have been putting up with her bullshit and letting her get away with things for far too long. The way she pointed at the piece of paper, showing off the profit she got from selling my inheritance. I would gladly chop her fingers off and feed them to the rats. The way she looked at us like we were beggars. She deserved it.
The evening at Noriko's place started off calm. All three of them chatted away about the most mundane of things, like the neighborhood sweet shop that had just undergone refurbishment recently. Despite the hatred that Genki and his mother had for Noriko, she had no idea how deep the vengeance had gone. They had never openly disclosed or voiced out any displeasure, after all. It always occurred to Noriko that, unlike her other nieces and nephew, both Genki and his mother were so much alike, not much of a character, in fact extremely dull. Despite having all the chances for them to get into the brewery business, both had chosen an easier job. It boggled her mind that both mother and son would rather work in a bento factory, scooping rice into a bento box a couple of hours a day, a few times a week, for the rest of their lives, instead of learning some skills in the family's brewery. So Noriko thought that she was being generous when, for the sake of their future, she decided to provide them a monthly stipend, enough for a simple life, but better than what they were already earning for the rest of their lives, as part of the compensation for selling the family-owned brewery. The news upset Genki so much that for the first time, instead of ignoring his aunt, like what he had done all his life as a coping mechanism, since young, he lashed out at her. And to stop the situation from escalating, his mother had to drag him out of the house without even attempting to know the truth about the reason for the decision Noriko had made. For them, it was nothing but an insult. Despite inheriting the Ishikawa's name, they have been reduced to what they think were mere beggars, receiving nothing but food scraps from their master's plate. If anything, they should be entitled to at least half, if not more, of the profits made from the sale.
So all this happened because you felt like you did not get a fair share from the sale of the sake brewery?
The officer continued, not wanting to miss out on anything.
All this happened because she deserved it. I went back and finished her off.
Genki replied, like it was his God-given right to punish those who have wronged him.
I should have gotten rid of her a long time ago. That's the only injustice here.
And, in another interrogation room close by, a mother, who had always been playing the role of an enabler, can be heard defending her son once more. But this time of a heinous crime, and despite that she continued,
"It was all her fault. If she had not provoked him, he would not have done what he did to her. If she hadn't sent the message disparaging him, there was no reason that this would even happen. You need to understand where he's coming from."
Ma'am, what we understand is that your son had committed one of the worst crimes that the country has ever had the unfortunate chance to hear of. No reason in the world could ever be used to justify what he had done to your sister-in-law. Not only did he take an innocent life, but Mrs. Watanabe had suffered tremendously at his hands until the very moment that she took her last breath. Do you understand the gravity of his crime?
I understand that he should not have taken things too far. I've thought him my whole life to ignore those who had wronged him, to be the bigger one. I've been nothing but a good mother. Do you know how hard it is to be a single mother? But have you seen the message that she sent us? Take a look at this, and maybe you'll understand why she had incurred the wrath of an otherwise good man like my son.
Still trying to justify the unjustifiable, while handing over the phone to the police officer, containing the messages that Noriko had sent them after they had left her home that evening. The message read,
"Genki, your behavior today was uncalled for. You shouldn't expect handouts from your siblings or relatives your whole life, and it's time for you to be independent from your mother. The only reason why I've decided to give you a portion of the money made from the sale of the brewery is because I was concerned for both you and your mom working minimum wage in the bento factory. But now that I get to know how ungrateful you turned out to be despite never working a single day at the brewery, I've decided to give them to your other siblings. They have always been better than you, and you should learn a thing or two from them."
We can all agree that the message wasn't worth incurring one's wrath. except that of Genki. At least according to his enabler. Thank you for watching and subscribing. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to stay tuned.